My name is Julie James. I'm a director of criminal justice at the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. And I'm really excited for this discussion with this terrific group we have here today. So I'm just going to start off with a little bit of context for how I come to this problem, and just say that for many of us, with notable exceptions in this room, the killing of Michael Brown and the subsequent revelations in Ferguson were some of the first times that many of us realized the size of the problem of fines and fees, and how the justice system, which had grown, and we were paying attention to mass incarceration, and we're talking now more about mass supervision, but less about how that system was funded, and funded most frequently by the people who were in the justice system. And that really revealed a national crisis in how local government was funding their systems. And together we've learned something about the scope of the problem. We have one national estimate that there's $50 billion in existing debt for 10 million individuals and families. And we've learned about some of the cascade of harms and consequences that can come from this kind of debt, from driver's license suspensions to housing insecurity to job loss and incarceration, even voting disenfranchisement. So this is a question of citizenship, as well as the economic harms that can attend it. But the truth is that we don't know the full extent of the problem, and we really need to do more research to understand that. And we need to understand how to undo those harms, and also what alternatives might work. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So a growing movement has taken hold, and there are a lot of people now who are talking about this issue, doing something about the issue, care about the issue in a way that they haven't before. But there are some really thorny questions that we want to deal with today. So today, to help us untangle some of those issues, is a wonderful group of folks. And I'm going to start right here with the treasurer and tax collector elected of the city and county of San Francisco, Jose Cisneros. To his right is Mark Levin, Vice President of the Texas Public Policy Foundation and Right on Crime, Joanna Weiss, Director of the Fines and Fees Justice Center, and Marianne Scully, Executive Director of the National Juvenile Defender Center. So I'm going to start by asking our panelists to tell us a little bit more about the scope of the problem. That's going to be kind of part one. And then we're going to transition into talking about what some of the solutions might be, both to the role of economic sanctions in punishment, as well as to how to fund the justice system. So, Treasurer Cisneros, among other things, as elected treasurer, you're entrusted with tax and revenue collection for the city and county of San Francisco. So I have to ask, since you're the money guy, why did you take on an issue that could threaten your revenue?
Hello. Well, we do collect the revenue for the city, but we really wanted to look at how we were affecting people in our community. So 2 years ago, we launched the Financial Justice Project, and we started by actually convening a conversation where we brought together community members who were really raising alarms about fines and fees in our community and how they were impacting some of the poorest folks in our city. We heard about people who'd had their driver's license suspended just because they couldn't pay a traffic ticket. And then, we all know what those consequences can be. They might have even lost their jobs because they couldn't get to work. We heard about homeless people who were given $200 tickets for sleeping on the sidewalk, but then with extra penalties, those grew to $500 tickets when left unpaid. We heard about snowballing late fees and credit scores going down. And we heard about a lot of dramatic impacts that people were receiving in their lives. So the Financial Justice Project convened, like I said, a task force. We brought together the folks in the community, and we sat them down with our government leaders. We had the sheriff there, the public defender, the district attorney, our transit agencies, representatives of our local courts, to really dig into this challenge and to see how fines and fees were impacting people. We quickly found out that people who were exiting the criminal justice system were getting hit with thousands of dollars in fees right when they were trying to put their lives back together. in San Francisco, we were charging a $50 a month fee for being on probation. And we were even being smarter than that. We were determining that most people were on probation for 3 years, so we gave them a right up front bill for $1,800 the minute they left jail. Well, you can imagine how most people aren't able to pay that. These fees just piled up on their records, and it really prevented people from becoming successful, from getting a job, finding a place to live, and getting back on their feet. We particularly heard one story about a woman named Mary. She got out of jail. She got clean from her addiction. She found a new job, and she reunited with her daughter. She really did everything right, but then she was stunned when she got this $1,800 bill for being on probation. I've seen how government works. I've seen how we run our budgets, and I know we can find a way to balance our budgets without settling it on the backs of the poor. In San Francisco, that probation fee I was telling you about, the $1,800 fee, the collection rate was about 9%. So, I mean, if that doesn't tell you, like, what's the point here, I don't know what does. These fees were high paying for people. It was hitting them right when they were trying to get better, and they were obviously with a 9% collection rate, not bringing much in to our city government. So I was very excited when our elected leadership in the city a few months back decided to eliminate all the criminal justice fines and fees in San Francisco on folks exiting the criminal justice system. Never more will we put those kinds of burdens on people. But we still had those years of folks who had received those bills years and years past. So I was just as excited to stand with our mayor just a few weeks ago where we announced that the City and County of San Francisco was eliminating $32 million of criminal justice-related debt off of the records of 21,000 people. Clean, gone. This, to me, is what government needs to be doing. I'm happy to talk more about what we've achieved in the Financial Justice Project, but I'm convinced that this is the right way for things to happen. Is it easy to get there? Not at all. We've had our challenges. We've worked together with different folks in our government, and we have still a lot more to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Treasurer Cisneros. And I hope you will forgive the liberty that I take in saying it's wonderful that you did it in San Francisco, but I think we wonder about the rest of the country. And so I turn to Mark as Vice President of Texas Public Policy Foundation for Criminal Justice. You work with conservatives across the country on criminal justice reform. And so what is the conservative case for this kind of reform? Are you seeing traction for these things that seem like the morally right thing to do, the fiscally prudent thing to do? What's your take?
Yeah, well, we're not calling it the San Francisco model, but it's, you know, who can argue with cutting the size of government if we're talking about cutting taxes or something like that? So, but this is, at the root of it, a government imposition on the citizens. And so certainly those of us on the right ought to be saying that, you know, if you believe in smaller government and less burdensome government, this clearly isn't that. And the other thing is, of course, it conflicts with other goals in the criminal justice system, and I would say legitimate goals, which, unlike revenue collection, for example, public safety. We hear from probation departments that sometimes folks don't show up for their probation appointments because they don't have the money for the probation fee. So how counterproductive is that? And so even in Texas, even though we've said you can't be revoked for not paying your probation fee, and 2/3 of motions to revoke being behind on your fee is one of the reasons for revocation, along with missed appointment or something else. So it's a big problem in that regard. It also trades off with victim restitution, which is, I would argue, is where we ought to be focused in this area of collecting money. And you know, it also just causes perverse incentives throughout the system. So people are kept on probation. This is coming from probation chiefs in Texas. People are kept on longer. So even though they're exemplary, but if they early terminate those people, those are the ones who are by and large paying every month. So they're subsidizing the whole department. Over half of the budget, and this is true in other states too, for probation in Texas is from probation fees. So, you know, we see that this is a huge problem. By the way, it's a big problem with driver's licenses as well. So you look at like Virginia, 1 in 6 drivers have their license suspended. It means you can't get to work to hold a job to pay the very fees that we were talking about. And nationally, up to 20% of the people going into county jails are for failure to pay. So it's driving the costs on that end. And then when you combine that with the collection costs, which you referenced, we're really not getting anywhere probably, which is what we're doing some work with the Brennan Center to hopefully show that ultimately all of this effort in collecting these fines and fees, both through jail costs, through contracting with collection agencies, through FTEs for government agencies, we're actually probably paying as much as we're collecting in many places. So I would argue then also with this whole panoply of fines and fees, we do also need to consider the cost of money bail as well as the cost of forfeitures. Each of those add up to billions of dollars. You know, and of course, for example, if you post bail and you're never convicted, you don't get your 10% back. So that's effectively a forfeiture. And then you have civil asset forfeiture, where even though, again, you're never convicted, the government has taken your property. And the vast majority of these are small amounts. You see cases like 1999 Chevy versus the state of Indiana. And the cost of filing a civil lawsuit, even though that person may never have been convicted, to get that property back would exceed the value of the property. You're not entitled to a lawyer, unlike in the criminal justice system. So all across the board, I think the bottom line is we have prioritized revenue collection over rehabilitation, over public safety. So it's time to change that. So thanks for what you did.
Thanks, Mark. And I think if there's anywhere in the entire justice system that we shouldn't focus on revenue maximizing, it's in the juvenile justice system. And I think the work that Marianne, the National Juvenile Defender Center, Juvenile Law Center, Berkeley Policy Advocacy Clinic, this growing coalition of juvenile justice advocates looking at the fines and fees issue. I mean, for many of us, I think we're shocked that that's an issue in the juvenile justice system, that that there is a cost for applying for free counsel, a cost for sometimes reimbursing the counsel for their time. And I know you're diving deeply into these issues, Marianne. So what is the extent of the problem? What are the special harms and consequences for kids and their families?
Great, thanks, Julie. So I wanted to start off just by asking the audience, how many of you work in the juvenile court system? Okay, so just a few people. So it is shocking when you consider what we just learned about what's happening on the adult side, and you think about the penalties and fines and costs that actually are assessed against adults. When we consider the impact on children and families, multiply the impact by many times, because it's a young person's future that significantly has barriers put up by these costs and fees. And what's the extent of the problem? So we know that in 36 states, young people are charged for the costs of an attorney. Generally, when you think about the United States, you think about justice, you think about young people getting arrested, most people think young people have lawyers by their side. Most people wouldn't assume that a young person, if they did have a lawyer, would be charged costs for that lawyer, would be charged a fee to even apply to get that lawyer. What we know is that in 36 states, young people are charged a fee to apply for a lawyer. They're charged a fee so their family can put together their financial records to figure out if that family can afford a lawyer. Then they're charged a fee for that lawyer in the system. And that's just the beginning of the process. We also know that in 29 states, young people are charged for probation. They're charged to be forced to comply with what sometimes we know is up to 30 conditions of probation. And then we know that extends their time on probation when they don't pay those fees. And it also leads to violations of probation, which leads our young people to be incarcerated. We live in the nation that incarcerates the most children in the world. And we do so in a way that's so racially disparate, there can be no other reason than bias. So we have to look at these fees and assessments that are charged against youth and families nationally, and we have to have a conversation about what we can do to push back. So one of the things we're doing as part of this collaborative is looking deeply into some states. And today we released a report about Arizona. And in Arizona, we saw 19 different fees that are assessed against young people and families. And what we see in Arizona are stories like one of our team members who was on the ground in Arizona watched a young person who was in court for something that happened in school. And the judge said, you know, you have a right to a lawyer, but you know, your family's going to have to pay $25 to apply for that lawyer. And the young person turns around and looks at his family. And you know you're going to have to pay between $250 and $400 for the cost of that lawyer. And the young person turns around and looks at his family. And the judge says, so do you want a lawyer? And the young person says, no. But what the judge didn't tell that young person is that when that young person pled guilty and got placed on probation, The family would then be assessed between $50 and $60 a month for being placed on probation. So that's just a look into one state, and we know this is happening across the country. So should we all be concerned about and lifting up the conversation about fines and fees? Yes. Can we all be doing something immediately to impact what's happening to our youth? Yes.
Thanks, Marianne. And now let's zoom out. Joanna, as co-director of the Fines and Fees Justice Center, and we have your co-director here, Lisa Foster. You have a national perspective. You're getting calls, I think you said, every day from all over the country asking, for help on the navigating the policy choices that they're thinking through. What are the arguments that you feel are most resonating with those folks around the country?
Okay, I think there are three arguments that are really resonating with policymakers in terms of why we need to reform our current system of fines and fees. The first one is the argument that fines and fees actually make us less safe. Mark touched on this briefly, but I think there's also some exciting research that's come out recently that also supports the notion that this is actually really counterproductive policy. Sansis and Yu and Goldstein just put out a report that looked at, they studied thousands of cities across the United States to look at their reliance on fines and fees and the impacts on public safety. And what they found is, on average, cities are earning less than 1% of their total revenue through fines and fees, though some cities are earning significantly more. And what they learned is that for every additional percent of the budget that is coming from fines and fees, that correlates with a 3.7% decrease in resolving violent crimes. And when we think about how cities use their resources, this makes perfect sense. If we have limited policing resources and we are using them as tax collectors rather than to protect public safety, those same police officers are not out there solving violent crimes that are hurting our communities. Another study that happened in the juvenile justice space by a researcher, Alex Pacquiao, found a correlation with heavier penalties of fines and fees correlated with higher recidivism rates. And I know that there's additional research coming soon from Bruce Western and Diva Pager, who are doing a really rigorous study to find the impacts of fines and fees, but this is one that we anticipate, frankly. Another thing that has really resonated with policymakers is the argument that fees in particular don't pay. And you've heard from Treasurer Cisneros and from Mark that basically collections are incredibly difficult, and it's something that jurisdictions tend not to consider beforehand when they impose fines and fees. If you can bring up the slide. Yeah, thank you. So the Berkeley Policy Advocacy Clinic conducted a cost-benefit analysis across 5 counties in California on the application of juvenile fees in the system. And what they found is a few things that were really interesting. First of all, almost no jurisdictions were taking in any significant amount of money really associated with juvenile fees. Most were taking in under $500,000 total out of all the fees that were assessed against youth and their families. The exception being Orange County, which somehow was making bank with $2 million a year. But what's interesting when you look at Orange County is that they were spending more than 82% of the money they collected towards collections. In other words, almost all the money that's coming in is just being used to build a collections process to collect more fees. It is not used the way it was intended, which was to recoup costs associated with the justice system. In fact, it's just creating more costs. And in Santa Clara County, they spent 112% of the revenue they collected. So in other words, in order to recoup $399,000 that they managed to generate in fees, they had to spend $450,000 to do so. And when the Berkeley Policy Advocacy Clinic presented this evidence, along with the harms that fees were causing youth and their families, and along with the incredibly disproportionate impact that this was having on communities of color, very quickly 5 counties in California stopped issuing juvenile fees. And Ann Stuhldreher was looking at that issue, I remember in Sacramento when this was going on, and this year California became the first state to end the use of juvenile fees entirely. So I think it's an incredibly persuasive, incredibly persuasive way of looking at this. Now, of course, I wish there would be cost-benefit analyses everywhere. I'm excited that Mark has partnered with the Brennan Center, and they're looking at the cost-benefit of fines and fees across 10 counties. But a lot of places you can't get the data. And I think there's other ways of demonstrating that this doesn't work. One is that the collection rates are incredibly low. Alexis Harris found that in Seattle in 2014, the city issued $740 million in fines and fees, and of that, they collected $4 million, which is 0.5%. Now, I think that's an anomaly, but it does show how incredibly difficult collections are. The other thing that we can look at is that as more jurisdictions turn to fix their budget gaps by imposing more and more fees, are we collecting more? And in fact, it looks like the opposite is true. So in Iowa in 2015, they had $682 million in outstanding court debt, which was a 475% increase in less than 20 years. So the amount of outstanding debt is growing far faster than the number of fees that are actually imposed, which suggests that when we impose more fees, people can't pay them. So this is not an effective way of generating revenue. The third thing that I think has been really persuasive to policymakers is to end the use of driver's license suspensions. 40 states are still suspending people's driver's licenses when they can't pay their fines and fees. And I think just logically, this is incredibly counterproductive. If you can't drive to work, you can't pay your fines and fees. And we know from studies in Arizona and New Jersey that when someone's driver's license is suspended, about 40% of people lose their jobs or are forced to take a lower paying job or one that's closer to home with fewer hours, an incredible economic cost. And what we also know is that many people continue to drive on a suspended license because in most parts of this country, there's no public transportation. And so in order to get to work or to get your children to school or to access your health care or to go grocery shopping for your family, you have no choice but to drive. And this raises a whole host of problems. The first one is if you don't have a valid driver's license, you can't get insurance. You can't register your car. So now we're forcing upwards of 7 million people across the country to drive without insurance, to drive without getting their registration, which is obviously terrible for all of us. The other thing that happens is we now have people who are driving and then they get caught and there are now thousands of cases in jurisdictions across the country for people driving on a suspended license simply because they couldn't afford to pay a fine or a fee, which now means that we are using our justice resources, our police, our prosecutors, our defense, our judges, our clerks, and even our jails to handle bad policy through criminalizing poverty. So I think that jurisdictions are definitely starting to understand that. 3 states have stopped doing it this year, and these are diverse states. This is California, Mississippi, Maine, and DC just voted, the city council and the mayor, to stop suspending driver's licenses there. It's awaiting approval from Congress. There are other states that are considering this kind of legislation in Florida and in Minnesota. And there are active lawsuits in a number of places where they are also trying to stop driver's license suspensions. And in fact, a judge in Tennessee just found that it was unconstitutional.
Yeah, this is an issue that is moving so quickly, and I think we'll see real movement if we continue to push over the next 3 years. And the thing that I found, for the lawyers in the room, this case is worth looking at. There was such strong language about how important driver's licenses have become to modern society and how it really actually raises the question of whether this could pass. This is so irrational that it might not even pass rational basis scrutiny for the lawyers in the room. So anyway, more to come on that. So now to solutions. We've talked a little bit about that sort of in the reverse and that we can stop doing all this bad stuff. But I kind of want to pull apart a couple different issues in this next round. One is, I think we didn't do definitions at the front, but I think it's important to distinguish fees, which are not supposed to be part of the punishment, which are really just to support operations of the justice system on the one hand, and fines, which are the punishment. So, in a system where fines are part of the punishment, how can we do that fairly if we do it at all? So that's kind of part of the question. And then, this is unfair, but this is my moderator's privilege. I get to ask 2 questions at once. The second is, if we do that, how do we fund the justice system? What's a fair way to do that? So, Mark, I'm going to start with you. Continuing with the theme that Joanna started on, what other legislative opportunities in this vein are you seeing? What movement are you seeing in the states?
Well, and in Texas, we passed a bill in 2017, actually 2 bills, which was a lot of work. But basically, before this passed, 600,000 jail days were accumulated for people not paying their fines and fees. And it wasn't as strong as the Louisiana bill, which basically abolished debtors' prisons in Louisiana. But what it did say is you need to adjust the amount based on ability to pay up front. Because before this bill, the judge could only do that once the person had become delinquent. And what this really gets to is the whole day fine concept, which Europe has used. And so it ought to be proportional to someone's income, since that is the degree of punishment they would feel is commensurate with their income and their assets. And I think as far as fees, as you said, public safety is a public good. So I have a real problem with the whole concept behind fees. Now, fines is something different, because you have, whether it's, Bernie Madoff, someone who commits fraud, there's reasons we might want to fine people. And of course, it's another kind of tool in the toolbox, instead of incarcerating them, instead of, effectively taking away their civil liberties through, supervision, which we just talked about on the last panel. So fines, the day fine idea, I think, has a lot of merit. And now, of course, there's also community service, which I think can be a positive. But we don't want to go too far with that either, where it interferes with someone's work and family obligations. So, but I think that as far as, for example, driver's license suspensions, we passed a resolution through the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is the conservative state legislators group, and it says states shall not suspend driver's licenses except for conduct related to dangerous driving. So we now have that as an approved model policy, and I hope more jurisdictions will adopt that. In Texas, unfortunately, we have something called the Driver Responsibility Program, which means after a single DWI or 3 speeding tickets within a 12-month period, your license is suspended unless you can come up with thousands of dollars. And the revenue from this goes to the trauma hospitals for emergency rooms. So, of course, they're saying we can't get rid of it. So we've been working throughout this interim to identify other funding sources and hopefully repeal this policy next session. So there is a lot of bipartisanship around this, so I think that's one of the positive things. Particularly on the right, there's a lot of energy against civil asset forfeiture, which I mentioned earlier. There's actually a Supreme Court case, which we filed an amicus brief in, called Timms, which is being heard later this year at the U.S. Supreme Court. And the issue there is kind of interesting because it's not the most common one, which is, of course, people having their property taken without a conviction and then having to sue to prove that it wasn't involved in illegal activity in order to get it back. The burden is actually on the person, the property owner, which is a complete perversion. But this case actually deals with a $40,000 Land Rover. This guy had a low-level drug conviction, but he was able to prove that this was a gift from his dad. It had nothing to do, it was not the fruit of illegal activity. And the issue is whether it was disproportionate, and the real legal issue is whether the Eighth Amendment provision against excessive fines and fees is incorporated against the states. And remarkably, the Indiana Supreme Court said it isn't. We expect the U.S. Supreme Court will say that it is, which could open up a range of legal challenges on all the things we've been talking about, even beyond those that are already underway.
Yeah, so Timms, TIMBS, is a case worth following. There were a raft of amici, and one was jointly written, just to give you a flavor, by the Cato Institute and Southern Poverty Law Center together, among many others. So I'm going to turn back to Mary Ann, if I may. So one of the solutions we hear about, and we've talked a little bit about the abolition of fees on the adult side, but fines and fees entirely for youth, because the system has different goals, and that we're trying to support youth and so that they can have a future, a rich future. Do you see that as an attainable goal?
I definitely do. And so when we look specifically at what's happening in youth courts around the country, we know that the issue of fees and costs assessed against young people, it's a nonpartisan issue, right? So we've heard lots of people up on the panel already talk about how we can work across aisles on this issue. But when you specifically talk about youth court, I think the strength we can get across the aisles is even more significant. So we've seen reforms happen in many places. One thing that happened this year is that we worked with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges to pass a resolution, and this is with a group of judges. So juvenile court judges who all agreed that we should abolish fees and costs assessed against children in juvenile court. Betsy, we have a slide with just a picture of the resolution. We also have some copies of it up front. And what we passed in conjunction with the resolution is a bench card on fees and costs. So any of you who are working in the court systems where you are, you can forward this bench card to the juvenile courts in your states and to your local jurisdictions and share with them the fact that judges agree we can eliminate these fees and costs. And what can we do immediately? We can ask our judges not to assess discretionary fees. We know that discretionary fees are up to the decision maker on the bench. So let's get rid of those immediately. What have we seen happen already? We heard already from Joanna the great work in California. Thank you so much for everything that's happened in California. They abolished juvenile fees and costs across the entire state, statewide in California, as of January 1st this year. It was a great effort supported by this collaboration mentioned earlier on the panel. But what did they get rid of? They get rid of fees assessed against children and families for detaining their children, costs of having a lawyer, costs of being on an electronic monitor, costs for probation, costs for young people to receive services like health care. They eliminated those fees that were assessed. Where else have we seen progress? Not in California, but as well Louisiana. In New Orleans, they said, okay, you're right, on the youth side, let's get rid of this stuff. So they, this year, in June, passed a resolution to say, no more fees in New Orleans. Where else do we see progress on the youth side? In places like Indiana. So we know that this issue, especially as it's addressed with young people and families, is something we can make progress on, I think, immediately.
And I think we're seeing that snowball in a really positive way. There's still a lot of advocacy to be done. So the discretionary piece is one, but elected officials on the local level also can have the power to do this, as we've seen in San Francisco. And with that, the forgiveness of the $32 million in debt, I think my tally has that California, in addition to prospectively eliminating fees, has now forgiven over $250 million in existing debt. And that's a number that we hope will rise over time and that will spread across the country in a movement that the juvenile advocates are working on called debt-free justice. So look for that in the months to come. To Joanna, other alternatives that we should be thinking about?
So I'm going to go back to your distinguishing between fines and fees. I think everyone on this panel agrees that the solution for fees is to stop using them. So I want to talk a little bit about fines. Fines are a reasonable way of punishing people. They can be a reasonable punishment to deter people from some kind of behavior that we as a society don't want. In this country, we use what's called tariff fines or flat fines, where there is a set fine depending on what charge you're convicted of, and regardless of your ability to pay or your own financial circumstances. And this raises three problems. First of all, if we are using fines to deter people, what deters me may be very different from what deters somebody who earns minimum wage, and may be, on the other side of the spectrum, very different from what deters Bill Gates. Also, in the wake of Ferguson and all we have learned about the consequences to poor people and communities of color, when people can't afford to pay fines, they are trapped indefinitely in the system, being punished over and over and trapped in perpetual cycles of poverty. The lack of consideration of ability to pay has led to really inequitable results. The third thing that this is leading to is terrible collection rates and a lot of frustration by jurisdictions that are imposing fines, and they're incredibly difficult and expensive to collect. It doesn't actually have to be this way. About 20 countries across Europe and Latin America are using a system called day fines that Mark mentioned earlier. Day fines are set in a two-step process. First, there is a penalty unit that is attached to the actual charge. So we decide how severe is this behavior that we want to, how badly do we want to stop this? How big an issue is it? So for something like a speeding ticket, it may have a unit of 0.5. On the other hand, something like robbery or assault might have a 10. That is designed without looking at anyone's ability to pay. But the second part of the process is looking at the daily income of a defendant, and it is adjusted down to take into consideration your basic living needs and the needs to support your family. And that adjusted daily income is then multiplied by the penalty unit, and a day fine is assessed. And so by using these graduated sanctions or means adjusted sanctions, we can deter people from the behavior we don't want. We can ensure that, that there's more equitable treatment of people regardless of their means. So there's a lot of positives, and it also has improved collection rates. And in fact, day fines were piloted in the United States. In 1987, the Vera Institute got together with NIJ, and they piloted a day fines program in Staten Island, New York, right here. And it was incredibly successful. And based on that success, there were additional day fines pilot programs that were launched in a handful of other jurisdictions that were diverse geographically, politically, and also in terms of the kinds of cases that were heard under the day fines program. And they were piloted in Maricopa County, Arizona, in Bridgeport, Connecticut, in Polk County, Iowa, across 4 counties in Oregon, and also in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And the outcomes of these projects were incredibly promising in a few ways. First of all, some jurisdictions actually collected more revenue when we switched to a day fines model. And this really makes sense if you think about it. If you issue someone a $200 fine and they can't pay it, you will collect nothing. If you issue a fine to someone of $25 or $40 and that is what they can afford to pay, the evidence and research suggests that people will pay that and get out of the system. So that also improves the collection rates and gives jurisdictions a much more steady, reliable source of income than the current tariff fine model. And obviously, it's far more equitable, and people don't suffer the same consequences of being trapped in perpetual cycles of punishment and poverty. Despite the success of these programs, they all sort of disappeared, and I think for a couple of reasons. First is they were issued in the midst of a tough on crime era. The second thing is they were issued during an economic boom, when jurisdictions weren't looking that carefully at their collection rates, and there wasn't so much pressure on them to make sure that all outstanding bills were getting paid. Circumstances have changed dramatically since then, and we think this is actually an incredibly ripe time to repilot day fine programs for a few reasons. First of all, I think there is growing concerns that the tariff model isn't working. It isn't working for people, and it's trapping people in the system. It's inflating our system and becoming a route to incarceration. Jurisdictions aren't collecting their money. All around, I think there's also bipartisan support, and I think Mark's point was really well taken. There are groups such as the ACLU on one side of the spectrum and ALEC on the other side of the political spectrum who say that we mean to have means-adjusted fines. And there are nonpartisan groups like the drafters of the Model Penal Code and the National Conference of State Courts who are all saying we need means-adjusted fines. So I think the time is really ripe. One hindrance to implementing day fines is the use of mandatory fees, which from the time that the original pilot programs were instituted until now, there is a really significant increase in the use of mandatory fees. And this is a problem. If we have a mandatory fee, we can't use day fines. So in New York, for example, even with a moving violation, there's almost a $100 tax, essentially. Mandatory surcharge that a judge can't waive, which means we can't assess what somebody could actually pay. But we think that if we can find a jurisdiction without mandatory surcharges, this would be a great pilot project. And a researcher named Beth Colgan has done a lot of research on lessons learned from the initial pilot programs that happened. Matali Negrecha of the Criminal Justice Policy Program at Harvard Law School is looking at this issue. And we have a group of researchers and policymakers who are very ready to provide guidance and technical assistance to any jurisdiction. Looking all out at you guys if you have a place to go, but for a place that's interested in piloting a day fines program.
That's great, and that Beth Colgan article is fantastic. It's new as of this year. Graduating economic sanctions is the first part before the colon, and it's sort of a primer for the policy issues that you'd need to navigate to kind of pilot this in your jurisdiction. But the research that Joanna mentioned with Matali and colleagues is based in Europe and is going to bring home lessons for what they've learned over the past couple decades and this sort of normalized approach to graduating economic sanctions. So it's been a while since we've heard from you, sir, and thank you for your patience. But we wanted to end on this one because it's the hardest. And it'll I think be a good launching point into what I hope is a very rich discussion in this room. So we've heard about a lot of options for reform. We've heard about abolishing user fees. We've heard about abolishing juvenile fines and fees. And we've heard about graduating economic sanctions, among other things. If we succeed at all of this stuff, we've heard that the sky won't fall. We might not lose revenue. We pay a lot for collecting these revenues. But what if we still have a gap? What do we do then? It's a hard question because I think it comes back to potentially taxation. And so I'm really interested to know your thoughts.
Yeah, the municipal governments, local government budgets, these are big, complicated documents. And I want to talk about that. But before I answer your question, I do want to say that following up on the previous conversations, from the very beginning, our Financial Justice Project really wanted to do two things. It wanted to eliminate fines and fees that didn't make any sense. I've talked about the ones we've already achieved that with. But we also wanted to introduce an ability to pay tool for folks who were getting the flat fine or fee, a flat fine for doing something wrong, for doing something that deserved a punishment. I can't say we've introduced it everywhere, but we have introduced it in a few places. We worked with our transportation agency that manages our streets, our transportation, and our transit system. So one of the things they do is they issue parking tickets. They tow cars that are parked where they're not supposed to be parked. And in San Francisco, if you get your car towed, it's between $400 and $500 just to go retrieve your car. You can imagine that for a low-wage worker, that is an impossible amount to reach, and a lot of those cars never get retrieved. We worked with the transit agency and with our human services agency. We created an ability to pay verification tool that basically just allows the transportation agency to check, and with information provided by the human services agency, we're a city and a county, so we have both, they can quickly see if that offender is on any kind of public benefits, food stamps, any kind of public support. And if they are, their fine amount is adjusted. So that $400+ tow fee is cut in half. And same with boot fees and other types of penalties they're putting out there. And lo and behold, many of the fines had a 400% increase in the payment rate and the total amount of greater revenue coming into the department. So, to answer your question, it doesn't always create a gap. In fact, we still need to do more research, and I'm glad that that's being done. But there are some situations where this is actually going to not present a gap and possibly even result in an increase. But back to the issue of where we are eliminating fees, there will oftentimes be a gap. So we convened, as I said, all the different parts of the government, and one of the key players we brought into that conversation was the folks that manage our city-county budget. Our annual budget of our city and county of San Francisco is $11 billion. So that's huge. And so even when we were faced with a $500,000 shortfall or $1 million shortfall, you have to put it in perspective. Every year, our government, along with every other government and every other organization in this country, we do an annual budget. And part of that annual budget is to project what the upcoming year is going to cost us. And we, unlike the federal government, have to publish and live by a balanced budget. So we can only live within our means each year. So we can only budget to spend what we expect to come in. Now, I promise you, nobody can absolutely tell the future. So those budgets, both on the revenue side and the cost side, are always going to be off. They're always going to be wrong by some amount. And part of what we do every year in our job is we massage and rebalance year after year after year after year. Something we thought was going to bring in $5 million might bring in $4 million. Something we brought in was going to bring in $6 million, might bring in $7 million. Who knows? It's all across the board. We're always doing these rebalancing systems. So in our financial justice project, we brought in the folks that do that rebalancing each year. And we presented to them the issues that we've been talking about on this panel. We're bringing in this many hundreds of thousands of dollars in juvenile justice fees. We're bringing in this much or very little on adult probation fees, so on and so forth. We think it makes sense to eliminate them, but if we do, what are we going to do to fund that department that was using what lot or little was coming in? The mayor's budget office in our city worked with us and provided those backfills.
I'm so curious, what was the reaction to hearing that this was the thought process?
I'll honestly tell you, I think this is one of the things I've been most pleasantly surprised with, which is that, at least in our city, and I don't know if this is true everywhere, I honestly think in our city, everybody in our local government who are really, I promise you, well-intentioned people, they really, really are. They're trying to do the right thing. They had no idea the kinds of impacts that we're all talking about here today. And then I know a lot of people in this room are well-versed about. But honestly, down to every individual person, they just didn't understand how those impacts were. So throughout our 50-plus city departments that are in our local government and amongst our elected officials, having that conversation with the local community leaders to help educate us on the way these impacts are harming people in our community, and to your point, stopping our community from getting better, stopping people from becoming more successful and getting back on their feet. They were shocked and really, really, their reaction was to say, well, what can I, as a government leader, do about that? And so their next thing after that shock is, what should we do about this? And they really started to pitch in. Some of our biggest advocates and some of our biggest champions in this effort have been the members of the mayor's budget office, who are sitting there now working with my colleague Ann Stuhldreher, the director of the Financial Justice Project, and her team, to go around from the department to department. And I think almost as quickly as we can react to seeing an injustice, those folks are sitting there going like, oh my gosh, they're scratching their heads going like, how can we keep doing this and how can we backfill? I don't want to make it sound easy. Local government budgets are always a challenge. There always needs to be a balance between taxes to fund government versus all other forms of revenue, which mostly fall into the category of fees and a few fines. We know members of the public don't typically like taxes. In California, a local government cannot create a tax without an approving vote of the voters. So you can imagine how easy that is. So fees are a reality and a solid part of revenue for a city. But fees are most commonly put on, someone who wants to start a business, someone who wants to build a commercial building. People like that doing projects like that, which are likely to be profit-making ventures for them, having them help the government recoup some of the effort of helping them be successful is perfectly reasonable. So fees are not necessarily a bad word. Let's remember that. There are plenty of okay fees out there. But fees that harm people who we're trying to have do good things, that's an important thing. I think what we really need to do in government is we need to have these very thoughtful conversations where we look at what amount of money are we bringing people unfairly and compare it to where are the other places we can get those funds. And in order to do that, our Financial Justice Project is working with the city departments and the mayor's budget office to do a complete inventory of every single fee that we put out in our local government, to find out how much is it, who's paying it, what's the collection rate, what's its purpose, and what possible impacts is it having that are unintended or damaging to our community, so that we can reform them if that's what it takes.
Well, that's terrific. And I know that Ann, yes, that's there's applause. We're getting close to the question and answer, so get those ideas going. But I know Ann and colleagues with Treasurer Cisneros is taking the lessons that they've learned in their process, and they're going to be sharing that in the months and years to come. So others in different communities can ask these same kinds of questions, can hold these same kinds of community engagement sessions, learn where the pain points are. I do want to come back to this one thing, though. So what is the fair way to fund the justice system? If we all agree that there are important things that our justice system does, what's the way to do that?
Well, at least from my perspective, again, you mentioned it in my intro, treasurer and tax collector. One thing I can tell you about taxes is they are, love them or hate them, they are try to be right-sized and fair to the people that pay them. By and large, taxes are something that are proportional. Whether you're talking about taxes we pay the IRS or our state governments or even local taxes if we pay local taxes, and in our city, individuals don't pay local taxes but businesses do, every single one of those taxes is based on an individual or a business's size, its income, and its profit. And that's basically is the mechanism that says, okay, everyone's going to pay, think of it as their fair share. And I think the more revenue we can get from right-sizing revenue that we draw out of the successful folks in our community, that's the right way to fund government. We all should pay according to our ability, and we should all pay our fair share. And if we do that, and we pay enough of that, and maybe pass some more taxes, if that's what it takes, I think we can afford to fund all the different parts of governments that we want to see happen, whether it's police or fire or filling potholes or running a criminal justice system.
Oh, Mark wants to get in a word here, and then we're going to throw it out to the audience.
Well, I think we have to.
Taxes.
The
Okay.
justice system is too big and too costly, and actually it relates to this because, like in Houston, over half the first-time DWI offenders, they choose county jail over probation, partly because of the fees. And we have the same problem with our state jail system. Now, by the way, in Texas, you can discharge a fine or fee by jail time. So these folks that do debtor's prison, that's what it is, they go to jail every night they sleep in jail, that's $90 or $100 off of whatever they owe. And so the taxpayers didn't get the money, and now they're paying the $85 a day that it costs to run that jail. So again, I think the bottom line is we need fewer laws, a smaller criminal justice system. You know, Ferguson, one of the cases was an overgrown lawn that this woman had, and that's how she ended up, going to jail because she couldn't pay that citation. So I think we need to just roll back the number of laws and roll back the punitiveness of our system.
This one requires more than one response. Go ahead, Joanna.
And just to add one more idea to that, I mean, the reason that we need to fund the justice system equitably is because the justice system is serving everyone. It is a core government function that is intended to protect everyone's public safety, not just the people who are immediately involved with it. It's really for everyone, and that's how it needs to be funded.
Justice for all. With that, I'd love to hear from the audience what your thoughts are and questions. We can start in the front and perhaps work our way back. Thanks. And when you ask your question, if you could just share your name, if you have an affiliation, and then we'll do our best to direct the question.
Okay. Hi, my name is Anthony Robles. I'm with the Youth Justice Coalition, and so we helped 9 years ago. We did a research report on the collection of fees from the juvenile justice system in LA County, and we put in stories of the youth and the parents who had to pay these fees for incarceration and probation and lawyers. And we won a moratorium in LA County on juvenile justice fees, which led to SB 190, which eliminated fees for youth in the state. So this was like a very important conversation. I learned a lot, and basically, and then me, I've been personally affected by these fees. Like I always wonder, like, why isn't anybody talking about these fees that are imposed on us? From when I was young, I would get tickets all the time for disturbing the peace or drinking in public, things like that. Racked up this huge debt and got my license suspended before I was even eligible to even get a license, a driver's license. And so I had to pay like $2,000 just to get my license on top of buying like a $1,000 car. So it was crazy. And it hindered me. It hindered me from economic productivity, from going to school, a lot of stuff. And so, and then as an adult, I was put on felony probation. I had to pay $4,000, but I got it reduced to $2,000. I had to pay $25 every month. I almost got violated at one point because I didn't pay for like an entire year, and they were about to violate me and throw me in county jail. So yeah, it's like it's a huge problem. And so when the Ferguson report came out, I was like, finally, like these uprisings that are happening is not just about one killing. It's about this systemic imposition of law enforcement into our lives and hindering us from prospering. So with that said, we're working on a campaign now in LA County to end fees and fines for everybody, not just youth, for everybody, and hopefully lead to another statewide bill or something. And so we're gonna have a convening on October 29th, and I just want to invite all of you, if y'all can come, because we want to have people that are working on this and that are doing this work to really come and share your perspectives and share the work that you've done and how we can implement that in LA County. And then we're also looking, hopefully, to have a conversation between like a wider, more general conversation between abolitionists and like reformers, and we're gonna try to hopefully get like some high-profile people, maybe Angela Davis or something. So we're hoping that if we can get somebody like that, more people want to come. But it'll be in Inglewood at our space, Chuco. So I just wanted to invite you and talk to you all after. So it wasn't really a question, but like, I just wanted to make sure that I could catch them.
It's great. I'm glad to hear about your work and what all that went into. I mean, there were years worth of coalition work to get to the California. So if that felt truncated at all, that's merely for presentation. But there were years and so many people who contributed to that. And thank you, Anthony, for doing that, for continuing to work on that.
Hello. Thank you very much for that discussion. My name is Ben Riddell. I'm with the ACLU of Illinois, working on some of the issues you talked about, including driver's license suspension, vehicle towing. One thing that wasn't mentioned, and I'll direct this to Marianne because she talked about the impact on children, and I apologize in advance if this takes us far afield, because one thing that I've found in our work on driver's license suspensions, that one of the biggest drivers of driver's license suspensions is non-payment of child support, which is not a criminal justice fine or fee, but often leads to people going to jail for driving on a suspended license, has all the same consequences with regard to inability to work, inability to take care of one's family obligations. So I think that public safety is impacted in a negative way, as well as people going to jail. And but there are the bill we're working on in Illinois would eliminate suspensions for most non-driving related violations. Child support is not among them, and part of that is because of the that issue is emotional, and like groups like the Coalition Against Domestic Violence say, don't touch that, even though there are a whole lot of people who are facing these same problems because of non-payment of child support. And I think it's further complicated by the fact that the federal government has certain laws that either incentivize or penalize states for not suspending licenses for non-payment of child support. So are there any solutions on the horizon, or that you all can offer? Thank you.
Marianne, look, no, I'm going to jump in, or did you want to say something? Okay.
Yeah, no, so we work in juvenile court with young people who are assessed fees, so non-payment of child support is not typically against. This is not my area at all, so I'm looking to all the people on the panel.
Maybe I'll jump in and say, I mean, there is litigation about some of this, the same kind of due process stuff that happens on the criminal side or on the civil or traffic side with incarceration. And so I could see an analogous move on the child support side for litigation that states taking away a driver's license is fundamental right or requires certain due process protections, and that it's not going to get you what you want, which is support for a family, for a child, gainful employment, and the rest. So I think there's certainly a policy argument to be made and potentially a litigation one as well. We have some connections through the federal government and the state offices of child support enforcement that might be worth exploring.
And the Financial Justice Project, Ann is taking the lead on this, is also working on child support. Ann, do you want to share some of the pilot efforts we're working on there? Here.
Hi, I'm Ann. Okay. When we started the Financial Justice Project work, we mainly started by listening And I was surprised when many people in the community said, what are you going to do about child support debt? And I didn't understand at that point that, and at first I thought, what? Like, we don't want to take money away from kids. And people said, oh, no. The problem is that when you make the payment, almost all of it goes to reimburse the government. It doesn't actually go to children. So in California, only the first $50 of what you pay goes to your kid. The rest of it goes to reimburse the government for any TANF costs or welfare costs. In California, we also charge 10% interest that compounds annually on that amount. So in California, the majority of child support debt is actually, and when families pay it, it actually goes to the government. 3/4 of the debt is owed to the government and not to children. In San Francisco, we believe that when a parent makes a child support payment, 100% of that should go to their children. It should not go to the government. In San Francisco, we worked with our child support director. We will not jail for the non-payment of child support. In a lot of counties in California, as many as 20% of the people who are in jail are in there for delinquent child support payments, again, where the majority is owed to the government, not to children. We also have set up something where a parent can get back their license if they come in and make a small payment and get on a kind of payment that's based on their ability to pay. And right now, I'm really excited. We think that a lot of the reason that parents are not making child support payments is because the money never goes to their children. So we raised some philanthropic funds in San Francisco and are paying off the amount that is owed to reimburse the government. And what we're seeing for those 40 parents where we've done that is that now, for the first time ever, now that those parents know all of the money is going through their children, 100% of them are making full payments and are making on-time payments. So this is being evaluated by the Urban Institute, and we're really excited to see what happens. So I think there's a lot of other reforms in this space happening around the country, and this is a really poorly understood system. And all the inequitable impacts and how it's really a collection system that takes money away from families.
Lisa is going to add to that, and then I don't know if this is a comment or a question, but we can turn to
just
the
very
next
briefly.
question.
At the very end of the Obama administration, Health and Human Services, the Division of Child Support Services, issued a new rule that actually took a very hard look at the question of license suspension. You're right, there's federal statute law that says, what it says is states must have the ability to suspend a license. It does not say they have to, it just says they have to be able to do it. And what the rule said is you shouldn't do it unless you do an ability to pay determination first, and what you find is that it was willful, that the person's just not paying child support because they don't want to pay child support, not because they're poor and can't afford it. But the links to the criminal justice system are enormous. The average parent who comes out of custody owes back child support. Federal law does not allow a judge to retroactively modify a child support order. So if your order was to pay $200 a month in child support when you went into prison for 10 years and no one modified that order, you owe all that money when you come out, and no one can ever erase that debt. It's just there. So one of the things the rule requires, and most states I do not believe are complying yet, is that when someone goes into custody, the state either has to itself modify the child support order or give the person going into custody the ability to do that from prison. So there are things, it's a rule, it has not yet been revoked by the current administration. So there are tools available to think about child support. But you're right, it's connected to the criminal justice system and it's having the same kinds of consequences.
So I don't know if we have right, so somebody up here in stripes, right? Or did you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Okay, sorry, please.
Hello, my name is Roman. I am a recent John Jay grad and working in the president's office. I'm also doubling as your humble
That's-
timekeeper.
That confused me. Sorry about that.
No,
Role
that was-
confusion.
That was the source of confusion. So I actually have a question about, we've talked about a few different policy areas, one being license revocation, another one being fines, and then fees. I wanted to ask about the concepts of reparations and reinvestment kind of in this arena. There's an interesting kind of analogy happening, or conversation happening around marijuana legalization, where a lot of the communities that are hurt most by past policies are not reaping the benefits of the legalization, and in fact, they still lost income. They still might have been involved in the justice system for those past laws. And while ALEC and the ACLU might have common ground on the question of kind of repealing these laws, I feel like there's a lot more divergence in the space of, well, do we reinvest in these communities that were harmed the most by these policies? And I wanted to know kind of what the groundswell is on that topic.
So one thing that
Thanks, Roman.
one thing that's happened is there's actually been a number of lawsuits where people have been wrongfully punished for fines and fees in ways that violate the Constitution. And the answer has been to reimburse people. And there was I think it was a $4.7 million case in Jennings, Missouri, that reimbursed, I don't know how many people who had been wrongfully incarcerated and wrongfully issued fines and fees.
Yeah, and my understanding is that that's hard to do in litigation to get damages, but and usually it's more like stop doing the bad thing. But that this was a really big win in that, and that we're, I think, seeing more of that in litigation.
Yeah, and there's been a couple more cases. Southern Poverty Law Center had a similar resolution of a case in Alabama. We are seeing more of those, but I'm not saying that is the right answer, but it is one of the ways that it's been handled by the system.
Yep, and in Philadelphia last week, the Institute for Justice won a case, and they have to give back millions to people that they wrongfully forfeited their cars and other property. So, yeah, I think it's only right to do that.
But I think it's a deeper policy question than, in some ways, than, well, I think it is, than just paying back what you took, because there was harm and damage done to the community and over time. And we're talking about the long arc of history, too, of course. So I think it's one that the policy community will need to engage with. So thanks for raising that, Roman. Question in the back here, and then, oh, sorry, you were next, right? Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, I'm Erica Vixilia with the Fountain Fund, and we provide microloans to formerly incarcerated people. And we live in Virginia, and we're founded largely because of the sad statistic you brought up, about 1 in 6 in Virginia. And so the question is, in addition to providing the microloans, really the bigger picture is about systems change and having more data about the problem and the impact of solutions. And so I'm curious, as we're thinking about what outcomes, what data do we need to have, what outcomes could we show that would be helpful so that we can get to the point. I'm so impressed with what you've done in San Francisco. And so how can we move Virginia in that direction since we're just getting started? What data, what outcomes, what should we be looking at?
Well, I mean, you mentioned it, the fact that the collections, so this is true in Texas. Our Chief Justice, Nathan Hecht, just released the data from the Office of Court Administration, and we're going to release a paper going into detail on it. But the bottom line is, since we adopted the bill to at least discourage the use of debtors' prisons and say, you can adjust the amount based on a person's ability to pay up front, our revenues per case collected have actually gone up. So that's one data piece that does help jurisdictions feel more confident about doing this. But I also think it'd be really good, and this is where it kind of gets harder to gather, but how do we gather data about people's success, being able to employment, being able to take care of their families, being able to move up the ladder, partly because they've been freed of these. I mean, you talked about up here how it compounds over time, whether it's through interest or impoundment. When, like the city of Chicago, they have terrible policies on impounding people's vehicles, whether it's for parking tickets or because they're arrested. It could be turned out to be a case that's ultimately dismissed. But every day that vehicle is on the junkyard, it's adding $50 or whatever it is, and it just keeps adding up. And so we have got to basically say, look, these policies are trapping people in a vicious cycle, and then be able to measure the positive outcomes in their life, the lives of their children, which is important as well, when we kind of take that these chains off folks through these reforms.
I'm going to plug the Financial Justice Project one more time. So they're up for an Innovation in Government Award at Harvard, and so they're going to be jetting off this week. They're one of the finalists, and part of that is because they did go through this very deliberate process, and I'll say that they plan on producing this toolkit that will hopefully be useful too. And there's also general research. Joanna mentioned. I'm feeling this energy in the room, like I just want to talk with you all forever, but we only have 15 more minutes. So there's this randomized control trial that Joanna mentioned that I think will be really useful in talking to the longer term outcomes. Bruce Western and Diva Page are looking at a cohort of youth in Oklahoma City, and they're randomizing who they pay fines off for and who they don't. And then they're looking at the outcomes, not just in the juvenile justice system, but also other life outcomes. Did you want to add?
One thing I just wanted to add, also, just to respond to this, is I think a really important part of figuring out what metrics you need for your community is really talking to impacted people and figuring out what are the fines and fees that are impacting your community, and then we can figure out, okay, what's being assessed, which of those fines, who are they impacting, who are they being assessed against, who is able to pay, and what are the consequences when people can't pay.
Again, my name is Michael Sapp with the City and County of Denver Department of Public Safety. I'd like to echo what everyone has said. This has been a really great panel. I've learned a lot, specifically on a lot of the programs happening in San Francisco. Denver's doing a lot of progressive work around criminal justice reform. But my question is one to the panel in general, but specifically to San Francisco, and that's really around the public relations, the political strategy for moving the needle to get these taxes removed and fines eliminated. And then two, Denver and San Francisco, we both have affordable housing crises. How are you able to move the needle politically? Because we also have a similar system in that we can't raise taxes without the vote of the people. How are you able to deliver that package, that messaging package to voters to agree to get them to agree to remove that barrier? Thank you.
Thank you. Congrats to Denver. You guys have a lot of great work going on there. One thing that's universally understood and felt in San Francisco is it's a very expensive city to live in. It is. I challenge any of you to try and measure up to the cost of living in San Francisco. Come on down, give it a try. It is tough. But we love our visitors, so do come visit. So when we talk about impacting particularly low-income people, the conversation really doesn't need to go much further. Just because of what we all know about the cost of living in San Francisco, the vast number of families that have to be considered low-income in San Francisco is astounding. I think, Ann, you were telling me a family of making $60,000 a year, 200% of income, in most places would be considered more or less okay. Those are poor people in San Francisco. They are struggling to raise a family of four, to find a place to live, to pay their bills, to send their kids to school, and to pay the rent. So when we talk about unfair impacts on low-income folks in San Francisco, it resonates very quickly and very easily, and I know that might be a unique characteristic to where we live. But I think what's really truly clear to people is a one-size-fits-all fine or penalty, or particularly an unfair fee, just makes no sense at all. And when we just scratched the surface, when we did some research, when the folks doing the research looked at the cars towed, remember, that got that $450 tow retrieval fee. Surprise, surprise, all the older low-value cars ended up not getting retrieved because they were usually owned by low-income families who couldn't afford to drop nearly $500 on the counter to get their car back. And so here we were, unduly impacting low-income folks. So really, the equation was pretty easy. We do live in a politically progressive city, and once I think the government leaders, and particularly the elected officials setting the policy, understood what the impacts were, they were on board to make the changes. Now, how do we solve affordable housing? Yeah, we'll talk.
But you didn't come with just a feel-good message. You came with the data, and I think that's a really important point.
That's exactly right. And one thing I will say to circle back to a little bit to our how do we backfill when there are revenue impacts is I think if we could do what Europe does, if we could not only lower the amounts of fines for people that are low income and only can afford to pay a lower amount, if we could do the alternative flip side and raise the amounts of fines for the billionaires, and we have a few billionaires living in our city, when they get a car towed or a speeding ticket, if their $200 ticket became $20,000, we might be able to fill some of those revenue gaps. I think that's what we all ought to be working towards.
Beth Colgan points out that in the U.S. that might face some political hurdles, and so that the policy package here might look like a statutory cap. But we all are, interested in that 42,000 guy from Norway who got that, big ticket, and wonder what he does for a living. Did you want to add something?
I also wonder how quickly reform would come if police were suddenly incentivized to stop rich white men in really expensive cars. How quickly would we get reform? I suspect it would come quickly.
Oh, how interesting. Yes, thanks for your patience.
No, I actually have a related question. My name's Rebecca. I'm with the Innocence Project, and we've been looking a lot also at the sort of intersection of incentives and innocence. For instance, we found that 14 state crime labs are paid by conviction rather than by forensic test, and so we've been really interested in kind of looking at these where these sort of things kind of interact, and I'm wondering, even on the fines and fees piece, if there's been kind of any look at sort of the introduction of new fines and fees alongside quotas and arrest quotas, citation quotas, or if there's been any research on that.
Not on that, and I'll just jump in and say there have been a couple of lawsuits on the conflict of interest that's inherent when someone administers the fund that they're collecting for. And obviously, Ferguson is the one that we all know about, but then there was a recent decision, Kane versus New Orleans, which explored this with regard to a judicial fund. So it just said, if you're acting in an administrative kind of executive capacity, your role and you're not a neutral decision maker. That's suspect inherently. So that's going to be a violation of due process. So I'm not aware of sort of looking at how you're judged and what your performance is as being the sort of driver of that behavior, but certainly a profit motive in those cases drove some pretty abusive behavior. Others want to?
Yeah, it came up in Louisiana, the judges, over half the money that's collected goes towards their salaries. So they were strongly against the legislation. In fact, I got shouted down by them at their continuing legal education conference where I was an invited speaker while this bill was pending. So, so it is the conflict of interest is very real, and of course it applies also potentially to police to the extent that, look at forfeiture. They fund all sorts of junkets and prosecutors. We had one in Texas use the money for Margarita Party. Another used the money to go to Hawaii. Now he actually got convicted for misappropriation of funds and went to jail. But this is it undermines trust in our system.
So we have time for one more question, then I'm going to ask for some closing thoughts.
Great. Hi, I'm Sebastian with the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. My question is about incentives for legislators. We talked a little bit about it, but if you're an individual legislator, then all the incentives align for you to assess more fines. You get to be tough on crime, you get to not raise taxes but raise revenue, and you get to pass a bill. So how do you change those incentives for individual legislators, or what does the education process look like for legislators so that we can stop additional fines from being created as we try to eliminate the ones that already exist?
Well, I guess you could have also mentioned some of these people can't vote too that we're assessing, but yeah, some of them low voting rates, right? Even if they can vote, we know that in poor communities, obviously turnout's lower, so that's an issue too. But one of the things I think is getting accurate fiscal notes on these things, so that you can see the burden that this is going to create over 5 years or whatever on these populations, and to also make sure it's in the caption of every bill that you're creating, whether it's a new criminal penalty or a new fine. A lot of times, legislators may not even realize what they're voting on. But the reality is that this is also an unstable funding source. That's one of the things we're emphasizing, the legislators, on the driver responsibility program, because the collection rates are so low, less than a third is collected. Depending on this revenue to fund the trauma care hospitals is a horrific policy. So you may think that you're obviously doing something positive in terms of what's being funded, but this revenue source is likely to really go up and down over time.
And I'm also glad that I get to work with Sebastian on this issue, because we'll have some ideas hopefully about it, and I hope you all will share yours. I know we had one more question, and I did want to try to get you in before our closing remarks, ma'am.
Pauline Curie, and I work at Greater Boston Legal Services in our reentry project. And I just had a comment on the child support issue. We had some legislation. It didn't pass this session, but it had some good ideas about dealing with the arrears issue. And what you could do, even though federal law prohibits retroactive modification, you can set an amount as to what triggers the license suspension. Like in Massachusetts, I think it was like $50 or $75, so we were trying to increase the amount. And then a second thing you could do is you actually can retroactively modify child support as long as a complaint has been filed. So what you could do is have the jails and the prisons give people information when they're at the beginning of incarceration. They just have to file the complaint and get it served, and the so-called 4D agency, the child support agency, is obligated to help non-custodial parents as well as custodial parents, so they can serve the complaint for you. So if we could get the information out there, that would help a lot of folks and prevent the accumulation of the arrearages.
Thank you so much for that, Pauline. Thanks for this rich set of questions and discussion. I would like to offer my panelists a last thought if they'd like to do that. And maybe Marianne, I can start with you.
So I'll just say that on the youth fees piece, just to go back to Sebastian's question for a second, I think we can frame it as youth success, right? So we know fees and costs create significant barriers to education, housing, financial independence for young people. So I think that's a great way to frame it. But I just wanted to leave the audience and say that if there's one thing you can do on the youth fees arena, is really just educate your loved ones, educate anyone you know. Tonight at dinner over a drink, tell somebody else that we charge kids for what happens in the court system. Most people don't know. And secondarily, if you're not sure what the fees are, contact any one of us on this panel. We will help you figure out in your state what it looks like, and then we ask you to contact decision makers where you are. So just to leave with that, there's so much that we can each do individually, and I hope you'll join us in this effort.
Thanks, Marianne. An invocation, if you will, Joanna.
And mine is actually a little bit responsive to Sebastian's question as well. I think that when we are looking to move this issue in jurisdictions, it's going to take a combination of qualitative and quantitative information. And we really need to collect as much data about what's really happening and who it's impacting. And we also really need to have the individual stories of people who are impacted. An incredibly successful campaign that I think is on the cusp of leading to legislative change around driver's license suspensions in Minnesota. They paired a prosecutor and an impacted person to talk to every legislator in each legislative district. The legislatures, the prosecutors, to talk about how this was impacting their caseload and what it was costing their community to spend all this time and money and energy to prosecute driving on a suspended license, and an impacted person who could actually demonstrate what this meant in a real world. Lisa and I are actually building out a clearinghouse of information that's going to have all of the research, all of the litigation, all of the legislative changes, all of the policy projects that are happening around the country. We're also trying to collect a bank of stories of personally impacted people, and we are also looking for people who are willing to share their story not only with us to be shared on our website, but also who are willing to speak to the press, because I think that's how we're going to move these issues, and also who are willing to speak to legislatures. So if you are working with a community like that and you think that people are willing to come forward and talk and share their stories, please come find me and talk to me, because I think that that's an important way that we're going to move this issue.
Great, thanks, Joanna.
Yeah, two things. First, family. I think we have to emphasize how and do some more research about the effect on family members. And obviously some parts of the public may not have that much sympathy for the person whose conduct resulted in the fine or fee or whatever. But you have children who were depending on that mom or dad to be able to have their car and drive them to school. and then you're just taking money out of the family budget for food and other things for the children, for the spouse. So I think that ought to be something we really focus on. And then secondly, you know, a related issue to all this is financial literacy, and it's a major problem for people coming out of prison, but likely also for people on supervision. And I mean, we can start early with this. I know the KIPP charter schools, they have student behavior accounts, which is really the exact opposite of all this, because they start out with a certain amount of money, and you know, they're able to redeem it for door prizes and things like that, like you would at an arcade. But these kids learn the way in which, you know, money works, so to speak. And so I think that we really need to be looking at that as well throughout the criminal justice system.
Thank you. Treasurer.
Yeah, I would just encourage everybody in this room, who I know are all doing great work, to really engage with your local governments. That's what our Financial Justice Project is all about. It's really doing and engaging this work right at the city, county, and court system level. And these are the folks that live and implement and charge these fines and fees and these penalties every day, day in and day out. But as I said, a lot of the folks, they just don't understand really what it's like to experience it down on the ground. And I think if we can educate them and work with them, we can see some improvements. I promise you, local governments want to make their communities successful. And yes, that includes helping big companies or wealthy people create jobs or new businesses or whatever, and those can be good at times, true. But they also means they want to help the neediest, most vulnerable people in our communities, and this is going to resonate with them that way, and I think we've got to get them to do that. Ann and I are actually excited about what we're doing. We're not done in San Francisco by any means, but stay tuned. But we're also looking for other cities and counties to work with. So if you engage with any of your local government folks and think they would be interested in maybe doing their own version of the Financial Justice Project, please reach out to us. We're putting together a program like that, and we'd like to partner with as many cities as we can, because it's that data and that body of work that's going to help create this all across the country.
Well, we've got our list, and I'm sure you've got yours. Please join me in thanking this fantastic group of panelists, and to you all.